Progressive podcast host Ryan Jacobs invited Barron Trump onto his show, expecting to expose him as out of touch and privileged. But as the conversation unfolded, Ryan found himself struggling to keep up, while Barron's calm logic left him questioning everything he thought he knew. The camera panned to a sleek podcast studio where Ryan Jacobs, a sharp-dressed millennial with a confident smirk, leaned into his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a guest who's no stranger to the spotlight," he began, his voice dripping with anticipation. "He's the son of the sitting president, a college freshman, and someone whose every word seems to make headlines. Barron Trump is here with us today." The camera cut to Barron, sitting calmly across the table. He was composed, dressed in a sharp blazer and open-collared shirt, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for having me, Ryan," he said, his voice steady and polite. Ryan leaned back in his chair, a sly grin spreading across his face. "I have to admit, Barron, I'm surprised you agreed to come on. I mean, your family isn't exactly known for cozying up to the media." Barron smiled faintly. "I'm here because I believe in dialogue, Ryan. Even when people disagree, it's important to have the conversation." Ryan chuckled, tapping his pen against the desk. "Fair enough. But I have to say, it's not every day I get to sit across from someone who's grown up in the White House. What's that like? I mean, do you ever get used to the cameras, the scrutiny, the constant pressure?" Barron's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained measured. "It's definitely a unique experience, but I think it's taught me a lot about resilience and staying grounded. At the end of the day, I'm just a college student trying to figure things out like everyone else." Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Come on, Barron. You're not exactly like everyone else. Most college students don't have Secret Service agents following them to class." Barron chuckled lightly. "That's true, but I think the challenges I've faced aren't all that different from what a lot of people deal with, just on a different scale. Everyone has to learn how to handle pressure and stay true to who they are." Ryan leaned forward, his tone shifting slightly. "And who are you, Barron? I mean, you've grown up in one of the most politically charged families in history. Do you ever feel like you're living in your father's shadow?" Barron paused for a moment, his gaze steady. "I don't see it as living in anyone's shadow. My dad has his own path, and I have mine. I respect what he's accomplished, but I'm focused on figuring out who I am and what I stand for." Ryan nodded slowly, as if considering his next move. "Interesting. So let's talk about that. You've been pretty vocal about your beliefs, faith, family, personal responsibility. Do you ever feel like those ideas clash with the world you're stepping into? I mean, college campuses aren't exactly known for embracing traditional values." Barron's expression didn't waver. "I think it's less about clashing and more about having honest conversations. I've found that a lot of people are willing to listen if you approach them with respect, even if they don't agree with you." Ryan smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Respect, huh? That's an interesting word coming from someone whose family has been accused of dividing the country." Barron's smile tightened slightly, but his tone remained calm. "I think division happens when people stop listening to each other. That's why I'm here, Ryan. I believe in dialogue, even when it's uncomfortable." Ryan's smirk faded slightly, and he tapped his pen against the desk again. "All right, fair enough. But let's be real. Your beliefs aren't exactly mainstream, especially for someone your age. Do you ever feel like you're swimming against the tide?" Barron nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes, but I think it's important to stand by what you believe in, even when it's not popular. Values like faith, family, and personal responsibility have stood the test of time for a reason. They're not just ideas. They're principles that have helped people build strong communities and overcome challenges." Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Strong communities, huh? That's an interesting take. But don't you think those same values have been used to justify some pretty harmful things? I mean, let's not pretend that tradition has always been a force for good. Barron tilted his head slightly, his tone calm and measured. I think it's important to separate the values themselves from how they've been misused. Faith, for example, has inspired countless acts of charity and community building. Family provides stability, and personal responsibility empowers people to overcome challenges. Those aren't harmful, they're essential. Ryan leaned forward, his tone sharpening. But don't you think that's a bit simplistic? I mean, sure, those ideas sound nice on paper, but in practice, they've been used to justify some pretty terrible things. Take systemic racism, for example. How do you reconcile your belief in personal responsibility with the fact that some people are born into systems that are rigged against them? Barron didn't flinch. I think we can acknowledge that life isn't fair without falling into the trap of victimhood. Yes, some people face more challenges than others. But the question is, what's the best way to help them? Is it by telling them they're powerless and need the system to change before they can succeed? Or is it by encouraging them to take ownership of their lives and make the most of their opportunities, no matter how small? Ryan's smile tightened. That's easy to say when you've grown up in the White House, Barron. Not everyone has the luxury of making the most of their opportunities. Barron nodded, acknowledging the point. You're right, I've been blessed with opportunities that most people don't have. But that doesn't mean the principles I believe in only apply to people like me. My grandfather came to this country with nothing. He didn't have connections or wealth, but he worked hard, built a business, and provided for his family. That's the power of personal responsibility and faith. It's not about where you start. It's about what you do with what you have. The tension in the room was palpable as Ryan shifted in his seat, clearly trying to regain the upper hand. You know, Barron, it's interesting that you talk about agency and empowerment, but don't you think your perspective is a little privileged? I mean, it's easy to talk about hard work and personal responsibility when you've never had to worry about where your next meal is coming from. Barron met Ryan's gaze, his expression calm but firm. I understand why you'd say that, and I don't take my blessings for granted. But privilege doesn't invalidate truth. The principles I'm talking about, faith, family, personal responsibility, aren't just for people like me. They've worked for people in all kinds of circumstances, including those who faced far greater challenges than I ever have. Ryan smirked, leaning into the microphone. So you're saying that if everyone just worked a little harder and believed in God, all their problems would magically disappear? Barron shook his head, his tone unwavering. Of course not. Life is complicated, and there are no easy answers. But I do believe that these values give people the tools they need to face life's challenges. They don't guarantee success, but they create the conditions for it. And that's a lot more than you can say for a culture that encourages people to see themselves as victims. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Barron's words hanging in the air. Ryan glanced at his producer, who was watching from behind the glass, and then back at Barron. Well, I'll give you this. You're a lot more composed than most people I've had on this show, but I'm not sure your arguments hold up in the real world. Barron smiled faintly. That's the beauty of free speech, Ryan. We can disagree, but at least we're having the conversation. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. Well, Barron, let's see if your beliefs can hold up in the real world, or if they're just relics of a past we're better off leaving behind. The room fell silent for a moment as Barron met Ryan's gaze, his expression calm but resolute. Let's find out, he said. The tension in the room grew as Ryan leaned forward, his tone sharpening. All right, Barron, let's get into it. You've talked about faith, family, and personal responsibility as if they're some kind of universal cure-all. But let's be honest. Those ideas don't work for everyone. What about the people who've been left behind by the system? The ones who've worked hard their whole lives and still can't get ahead? Are you saying it's their fault? Barron remained calm, his hands resting lightly on the table. I'm not saying it's anyone's fault, Ryan. What I'm saying is that we need to focus on solutions that empower people, not ones that make them dependent on a system that might fail them. Hard work doesn't guarantee success, but it does create opportunities. And when you combine that with strong communities and a sense of purpose, people can overcome incredible challenges. Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. That sounds nice in theory, but in practice, it's not that simple. You talk about personal responsibility, but what about systemic barriers? Racism, sexism, income inequality? These aren't things people can just work hard to overcome. Don't you think it's a little naive to ignore those realities? Barron leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. I'm not ignoring those realities, Ryan. I'm saying that focusing solely on them can be paralyzing. If we tell people they can't succeed because the system is against them, we're taking away their agency. Yes, we should work to improve the system, but we can't lose sight of the fact that individuals have the power to change their own lives, even in the face of adversity. Ryan smirked, sensing an opportunity to press harder. You know, Barron, it's interesting that you talk about agency and empowerment, but let's be real. You've never had to face adversity. You've grown up in the White House, surrounded by wealth and privilege. How can you possibly understand what it's like for someone who's struggling just to get by? Barron nodded, acknowledging the point. You're right, Ryan. I've been blessed with opportunities that most people don't have. But that doesn't mean I can't empathize with people who are struggling. My grandfather came to this country with nothing. He didn't have connections or wealth, but he worked hard, built a business, and provided for his family. That's the power of personal responsibility and faith. It's not about where you start. It's about what you do with what you have. Ryan's smirk faded slightly, but he wasn't ready to back down. Okay, but what about the people who don't have a fair shot? What about the single mom working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on? Are you saying she just needs to work harder? Barron shook his head. Not at all. I'm saying we should focus on solutions that empower her, not ones that make her dependent on a system that might fail her. For example, instead of just giving her a check, why not create opportunities for her to learn new skills, start a business, or find a better job? That's what real compassion looks like, helping people help themselves. The room grew quiet for a moment as Ryan considered Barron's words. Then he leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. That's a nice sentiment, Barron, but it's not that simple. You can't just tell people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they don't even have boots. That's why we need systemic change, policies that level the playing field and give everyone a fair shot. Barron's gaze didn't waver. I agree that we need to create opportunities for people, Ryan. But the problem with focusing solely on systemic change is that it takes time, sometimes decades. In the meantime, what do we tell people? That they're stuck until the system changes? Or do we encourage them to take control of their lives and do what they can with what they have? I believe in empowering individuals because that's something we can do right now. Ryan leaned forward again, his tone growing more aggressive. But what about systemic racism, Barron? You can't just ignore the fact that entire groups of people have been held back for generations. How do you expect them to succeed when the deck is stacked against them? Barron's voice remained calm, but there was a new intensity in his eyes. I'm not ignoring systemic racism, Ryan. I'm saying that the best way to fight it is by empowering individuals to rise above it. My father's administration has focused on creating jobs, improving. The room fell silent again, the weight of Barron's words hanging in the air. Ryan glanced at his producer, who was watching from behind the glass, and then back at Barron. Well, I'll give you this. You're a lot more composed than most people I've had on this show, but I'm not sure your arguments hold up in the real world." Ryan leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You talk a big game about personal responsibility, Barron. But let's be honest, how much of that is just privilege talking? Do you really believe your family's version of success applies to everyone?" Barron met his gaze, calm and unshaken. "It's not about my family, Ryan. It's about principles that work, whether you're in the White House or starting with nothing." Before we dive into the final part of this debate, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking conversations like this one. Your support helps us keep these important discussions going. All right, Barron, let's cut to the chase. You've talked a lot about personal responsibility and empowering individuals, but let's be real. Your family's policies have been accused of favoring the wealthy and ignoring the struggles of everyday Americans. How do you justify that? Barron didn't flinch. His calm demeanor remained intact as he met Ryan's gaze. "I justify it by looking at the results, Ryan. Under my father's administration, we've seen record-low unemployment rates, especially for minority groups. We've increased funding for historically black colleges and universities, passed criminal justice reform, and created opportunity zones that have brought investment to underserved communities. These aren't just policies. They're real, tangible changes that have helped people improve their lives." Ryan smirked, clearly unimpressed. "But those changes don't address the root of the problem, Barron. They're just Band-Aids on a broken system. What about systemic racism? What about income inequality? You can't just throw a few programs at the problem and call it a day." Barron leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not saying the system is perfect, Ryan, but I believe in focusing on what works. And what works is creating opportunities for people to succeed, not trapping them in cycles of dependency. Systemic change is important, but it takes time. In the meantime, we need to empower individuals to take control of their own lives. That's how we create real, lasting change." Ryan's expression hardened. "And what about the people who can't take control of their lives, Barron? What about the single mom working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on? What about the people who've been held back by generations of systemic oppression? Are you saying it's their fault they're struggling?" Barron shook his head, his tone unwavering. "Not at all. I'm saying we need to give them the tools to succeed. That single mom doesn't need pity. She needs opportunities. She needs access to affordable child care, job training programs, and a community that supports her. That's what real compassion looks like, helping people help themselves." Ryan leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. "That's a nice sentiment, Barron, but it's not that simple. You can't just tell people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they don't even have boots. That's why we need systemic change. Policies that level the playing field and give everyone a fair shot." Barron nodded thoughtfully. "I agree that we need to create opportunities for people, Ryan. But the problem with focusing solely on systemic change is that it takes time, sometimes decades. In the meantime, what do we tell people? That they're stuck until the system changes? Or do we encourage them to take control of their lives and do what they can with what they have? I believe in empowering individuals because that's something we can do right now." Ryan's smirk faltered slightly, but he wasn't ready to back down. "You make it sound so easy, Barron. But the truth is, not everyone has the same opportunities you've had. You've grown up in the White House, surrounded by wealth and privilege. How can you possibly understand what it's like for someone who's struggling just to get by?" Barron met Ryan's gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "You're right, Ryan. I've been blessed with opportunities that most people don't have. But that doesn't mean I can't empathize with people who are struggling. My grandfather came to this country with nothing. He didn't have connections or wealth, but he worked hard, built a business, and provided for his family. That's the power of personal responsibility and faith. It's not about where you start. It's about what you do with what you have. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but Barron continued, his voice steady and firm. Look, Ryan, I'm not saying life is fair. It's not. But the answer isn't to tell people they're victims of the system and can't succeed. The answer is to give them the tools and opportunities they need to rise above their circumstances. That's what my father's administration has been focused on: creating jobs, improving education, and supporting small businesses in underserved communities. Those are real, tangible solutions that help people succeed, regardless of the obstacles they face. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Barron's words hanging in the air. Ryan glanced at his producer, who was watching from behind the glass, and then back at Barron. Well, I'll give you this. You're a lot more composed than most people I've had on this show, but I'm still not convinced your ideas hold up in the real world. Barron smiled faintly. That's the beauty of free speech, Ryan. We can disagree, but at least we're having the conversation. Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. Fair enough. I'll give you the last word, Barron. What's the one thing you want people to take away from this conversation? Barron paused for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I want people to know that they're not powerless. No matter where you start in life, you have the ability to make choices that can change your future. It's not easy, and it's not always fair, but it's possible. And if we focus on empowering individuals, strengthening families, and building communities, we can create a better future for everyone. Ryan nodded slowly, his smirk replaced by a more serious expression. Well, there you have it, folks. Barron Trump, the son of the sitting president, making his case for personal responsibility and traditional values. Agree or disagree, you can't deny he's got a way with words. The camera zoomed out as the outro music began to play, leaving the audience with one final image of Barron sitting calmly at the table, his expression resolute. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking conversations like this one. Your support helps us keep these important discussions going.